Why did the United States send an entire heavily armed naval fleet to Antarctica right after World War II? And why, to this day, is the continent locked down by a strict international military treaty? Well, let's dive right into this explainer. Because we've all been taught to look at Antarctica as just this barren, frozen wasteland dedicated to peaceful scientific research. But the source material we're auditing today, it frames things in a radically different light. According to these documents, we aren't looking at a continent of penguins. We're looking at the heavily militarized edge of the world.
To really get into this, we have to ask ourselves why. Immediately following the absolute devastation of World War II, the U.S. launched the largest expedition to the Antarctic in human history. Think about the historical context for a second. It's 1946, the American military is rapidly demobilizing, aggressively cutting budgets, the war is over. Yet, right in the middle of this massive drawdown, they suddenly decide to send a colossal naval armada to the bottom of the world. What could possibly justify that kind of risk and expenditure?
We're talking about 4,700 heavily armed combat troops, under the command of the legendary polar explorer Admiral Richard E. Byrd. In August 1946, Operation High Jump deployed those troops alongside 13 ships and 33 aircraft. So, this wasn't exactly a small team of geologists in parkas. This was Task Force 68. We're talking destroyers, submarines, marine tactical units, and an entire aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea. Now, there's a pretty stark contrast between the flimsy official narrative and what our source text asserts. Officially, they were just training personnel and testing equipment in frigid conditions. But the source document, which refers to itself as the Gnostic Indictment, points out that you simply don't send an aircraft carrier and thousands of combat veterans to the South Pole just to test cold weather gear. It presents this whole operation as a classified combat reconnaissance mission. The true objective? To secure a massive pre-Diluvian Archonic command node hidden under the ice. They were essentially going to war. And things went south fast. The expedition was slated to last up to 8 months. Instead, it was an absolute disaster. The fleet suffered heavy casualties and was routed in just 8 weeks. By February 1947, they were making a chaotic, abrupt retreat. And according to leaked ship logs and sailor testimonies detailed in the text, it wasn't the weather that defeated them. They were reportedly engaged by silent, wingless, disc-shaped craft that emerged right out of the water and the ice, moving at impossible speeds and firing devastating energy weapons. To really grasp the severity of that defeat, look at what happened immediately after they got back. You have an active-duty, highly decorated American admiral issuing a truly terrifying public warning. In a March 1947 interview with the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, Admiral Byrd explicitly warned that the U.S. needed to take immediate defensive measures against technologically superior adversaries that could fly from pole to pole with incredible speeds. A military leader of his stature doesn't just go and panic a foreign press syndicate unless he's just fought a war against a non-conventional threat and lost.
Act 2. Subglacial physics. Why actually hide under all that ice? Okay, so if you possess advanced craft that can literally bend space-time, why on earth would you hide beneath 2 miles of frozen water? The source claims it all comes down to the brutal thermodynamic and electromagnetic realities of high-energy physics. You see, thousands of feet of dense, pressurized ice acts as an ultimate dielectric shield. A dielectric is an insulator that holds back massive amounts of electromagnetic energy. So 2 miles of solid ice? It's a perfect barrier. It renders any subterranean command node completely invisible to human orbital thermal imaging or ground-penetrating radar. To our satellites looking down, it just looks like a blank white map. Plus, deep beneath that ice sheet are massive bodies of water, like Lake Vostok. The text explains that these subglacial lakes act as essential thermal heat sinks. The high-energy, mass reduction drives required for these advanced craft generate apocalyptic amounts of waste heat. We're talking gigawatts of thermal energy. If you vented that into the open air, every infrared camera on Earth would see the thermal bloom. But if you vent it into a freezing subglacial lake trapped under a dielectric ice shield, the heat is completely absorbed. It is quite literally the ultimate stealth environment. Which perfectly brings us to the Wilkes land anomaly. This is a massive, 300-mile-wide magnetic and gravitational signature detected by NASA's GRACE satellites back in 2006. Now, the official scientific excuse is that it's just an ancient meteor impact crater, but the source heavily disputes this. They argue that a simple meteor crater does not emit a highly structured, intense magnetic field that persists for millions of years. Instead, they argue this 300-mile-wide anomaly is the exact signature of a massive subterranean power source, some kind of dormant or maybe even active piece of macro engineering buried deep under the ice. All right, Act 3, the global military quarantine and the truth about the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. After the catastrophic failure of Operation High Jump, the military realized they just couldn't defeat these bases conventionally. So, the source claims the global elite pivoted to a new strategy: absolute secrecy. Just look at the forensic contrast here. Everywhere else in the world, the US and the Soviets were at each other's throats, aiming nuclear weapons at each other, fighting bloody proxy wars. But in Antarctica, flawless cooperation, unprecedented unity. They shared bases and jointly enforced a quarantine. The source views this weird Cold War cooperation as proof that a higher non-human directive was basically forcing their hand. So the source frames the Antarctic Treaty completely differently than how we're taught in school. It's not a peaceful, scientific, or environmental pact. It is an absolute, mandatory, global military quarantine, an ironclad legal barrier ensuring no independent citizen or private corporation ever wanders far enough into the ice to stumble upon this southern command node. It is the ultimate globally enforced no trespassing sign, holding back human curiosity. And this quarantine is very much active today. The text points to perfectly circular, strictly enforced no-fly zones right near the South Pole. It notes how commercial satellites passing over these specific regions constantly experience these highly convenient data dropouts, or they return imagery to Google Earth that's just clumsily pixelated or blacked out by sensors. The source dryly points out a crazy fact. We actually have more detailed, unrestricted public maps of the surface of Mars than we do of certain regions of our own planet's southern pole. Yet, despite all these extreme militarized restrictions keeping us out, there's this bizarre parade of VIPs making highly secretive pilgrimages to the ice. The source highlights some very strange timing. You got U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry supposedly traveling there to study climate change on November 8, 2016, literally the exact day of the most contentious U.S. presidential election in modern history. Or Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, visiting in February 2016 to deliver an ancient religious artifact. The source doesn't view these as normal diplomatic trips. They view them as summits with the true power structure hidden below. So, I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If Antarctica is truly nothing more than an empty, freezing expanse of ice and penguins, why is it governed by a military treaty that supersedes all national laws? And why are the world's political and religious elites making secret pilgrimages to the most heavily guarded quarantine zone on Earth? According to the source material we've unpacked today, the ice wall is real, not to hold in the oceans, but to hold back humanity. I guarantee you'll never look at a map of the world the exact same way again.